Pick that up, sweetheart." That is what Dr. Caldwell said 47 minutes before everything changed. St. Michael's ICU at 11 p.m. smells like antiseptic and floor wax under fluorescent lights that hum like machinery grinding bone. The heart monitors beat their steady rhythm down the darkened corridor, a percussion section of lives measured in beats per minute. Brooke Sullivan moves through the unit in navy blue scrubs that blend with the shadows, her hand steady on patient charts, her voice pitched low when she speaks to the elderly man in bed 6 who's afraid of the dark. She's been invisible here for 3 years, just another competent night shift nurse who arrives, does her work, and leaves without a story. Nobody asks where she learned to suture with surgical precision. Nobody asks about the scars on her forearms, thin white lines that run like shrapnel patterns across her skin. Tonight is like every other night. She checks vitals at 2,300 hours, documents fluid intake, adjusts an 4-line on a post-op patient whose breathing is shallow but steady. The work is muscle memory now, the kind of rhythm you fall into when you've done something 10,000 times. At 23:37, Dr. Marcus Caldwell arrives for evening rounds, his white coat pressed sharp as a blade, his movements carrying the weight of someone who believes the world orbits around him. He's been at St. Michael's for 18 years, long enough to know which board members take his calls, long enough to have collected favors like other men collect money. His smile is the smile of a man who has never been told no by anyone who mattered. He reviews the medication board for the post-op patient in bed 3, the one who came in after a routine hernia repair 6 hours ago. The chart shows vitals stable, pain managed, but Caldwell's prescribing the dosage for a man twice this patient's body weight, a mistake that would send the man's blood pressure into a cascade of complications by morning. Brooke is passing the station when she reads it. The dose is 0.5 milligrams when it should be 0.25. She stops. She doesn't speak loudly. She doesn't make it a scene. She simply steps forward, places her finger on the chart, and says, "Doctor, the patient's weight is 163 pounds. That's double the recommended dose for this medication." Her voice is quiet. Her tone is respectful. Her fact is undeniable. A resident named Patterson, young, eager, watching Caldwell like a puppy, shifts his weight and suddenly realizes his mentor just tried to kill somebody. The silence in the nurse's station stretches thin. Caldwell's jaw tightens. He writes a new prescription in pen, crosses out the original, and walks away without acknowledging her. But she has just done something unforgivable in his world. She has made him look fallible in front of someone junior. She has suggested, however gently, that his judgment is not beyond question. She has threatened the reputation he spent 2 decades polishing through donations to the hospital foundation and strategic lunches with people who sign the checks. At 23:54, standing in the hallway outside the supply closet while restocking 4 kits, Brooke overhears Caldwell in the break room. He's on his phone. He's calling someone. She can't hear the name, but she can hear the words, "There's a nurse on the night shift who thinks she's smarter than me. Navy background, maybe. I'm going to make her quit within a week. Consider it a personal project." He laughs. The laugh is the sound of a man who has never experienced consequences. By 0600, when the day shift arrives and the night shift prepares to hand off patients, Caldwell is stationed at the nurse's station like he owns it. He announces it loudly enough that everyone hears, "I'm taking bets. $10 says the competent new nurse here quits within 7 days. Who's in?" 2 residents laugh. A nurse from day shift shakes her head and says nothing. Brooke refills a medication cup and doesn't look up. But the words hang in the air like a challenge, like a gauntlet dropped, like a threat wrapped in the package of casual workplace humor. This is stage 1 of his escalation: social attacks, public mockery, the kind of bullying that lives in the gray space where nobody can quite call it what it is. The next morning, at 1,230 hours, Brooke carries her lunch tray through the cafeteria during peak hours. The line extends back toward the entrance, dozens of hospital staff grabbing 30 minutes away from dying people. She's balancing her tray, grilled chicken, rice, a bottle of water, when Caldwell moves through the crowd toward her. He's walking with purpose. He times it perfectly so that he passes directly beside her, and as he does, his elbow comes up, a casual gesture that connects with the edge of her tray and sends it tumbling. The plate shatters on the tile floor. The rice scatters like sand. The water bottle rolls toward the trash can. The room doesn't go silent. That's what people always get wrong. The room stays loud. Conversations continue. Nobody saw it. Nobody saw the timing. Nobody saw the intention. Caldwell walks on, and someone, a housekeeping attendant, starts cleaning up the mess. Brooke looks down at her spilled lunch, then at the space where Caldwell disappeared into the crowd. Her jaw tightens. Her hands clench once, then relax. She walks to the grab-and-go station, picks up a salad in a plastic clamshell, and eats it standing at a high-top table alone, chewing each bite with the kind of controlled precision that comes from somewhere deep, from muscle memory that's older than this hospital, older than this city, older than the life she's built in the space where nobody knows who she actually is. She has been invisible for so long that invisibility has become its own kind of armor. But at 1,600 hours, during the afternoon shift when she's working part of the day overlap for a colleague covering a call-out, something shifts. The unit receives a new admission, a Navy Admiral admitted for acute cardiac evaluation, transferred from Brooke Army Medical Center, currently under observation in the ICU for possible pericardial effusion. The name on the chart is Admiral Marcus Patterson, age 58, service record classified. Brooke reads the name twice. Her hands pause over the chart. She looks at the patient through the glass partition of the isolation room, and something in her chest compresses like a fist. She knows that face. She doesn't know how that's possible, but she knows it. 20 years collapse into a single moment of recognition. She sees a 6-year-old boy covered in dust and blood, pulled from the rubble of a collapsed apartment complex in Tikrit, Jolan district, while mortar fire screamed overhead and her ears rang from the percussion of explosives. She sees that boy's eyes looking up at hers while her hands applied pressure to his wounds, while her body shielded him from a secondary burst, while her voice told him in a steady whisper that he was going to live, that she wouldn't let him go, that her unit motto was "Leave no one behind," and she meant it with everything in her chest. She doesn't speak to the Admiral. She doesn't approach his room. She documents his vitals from a distance and watches the other nurses provide his care, moving through the afternoon and evening like she's walking through water. At 2,100 hours, when the night shift takes over and most of the floor is dark, she opens her locker in the staff room. Behind her street clothes, behind the zippered pocket where she keeps her ID and her keys, sits a pair of worn combat boots. The leather is desert tan with dark scuff marks, creases that map out years of walking through sand and rubble and fear. The laces are frayed. The insoles have worn thin. She's kept them for 20 years, and she's never once worn them in this life. She touches the laces. Her fingers are steady. She doesn't tremble. She doesn't allow herself the luxury of feeling anything in a place where someone might walk in and see her. She pulls her hand back, closes the locker, and returns to the unit. The Admiral is asleep in bed 4. The monitors show his heart rate at 71, his oxygen saturation at 97%, his blood pressure holding stable at 118/76. He looks peaceful. He looks safe. He has no idea that the nurse standing outside his room spent 6 years of her life learning how to keep people alive in places where staying alive was measured in minutes. He has no idea that she carried him out of a war zone 20 years ago. He has no idea that the person who corrected Dr. Caldwell's mistake this morning was the last person to see him before his life began in earnest, before he became an admiral, before he forgot the woman in navy scrubs who'd made him a promise in the dust and blood of Tikrit. But that's the thing about being invisible. Nobody ever imagines what the quiet person is really made of. The bet announcement came during shift change, when the nurses' station was packed with 8 nurses and 4 residents shuffling through charts and assignment boards. Dr. Caldwell stood at the counter like he owned it, because in his mind, he did. His voice carried that particular confidence of a man who'd spent 20 years building alliances instead of healing patients. "I'll give her a week," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. His eyes found Brooke across the room, updating a patient chart. Anyone want to take the bet? She's got that military confidence thing, you know the type. Thinks she's special. He laughed, and 3 residents joined him like wind chimes in a breeze. Brooke's pen kept moving across the page in steady strokes. One nurse glanced at her, waiting for a reaction, a flush of anger, a tremor in her hands, something. Brooke's jaw tightened fractionally. That was all. Her handwriting remained perfectly even, each letter formed with precision, as if the words spoken around her were just background noise, like the hum of the ventilators or the distant beep of monitors in other rooms. She turned the page and continued documenting. Caldwell watched her composure hold and felt something twist in his chest, not quite anger, not quite fear, something closer to frustration. He'd spent 2 decades cultivating his power through hospital board dinners and strategic favors, and this woman, this night shift nurse in Navy scrubs, had corrected him in front of a resident. She'd made him look small. He'd expected to see her crumble by now. Instead, she looked unmoved, which somehow felt worse. The next afternoon, the cafeteria during lunch rush was chaos. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with that particular frequency that made everything feel slightly unreal. Brooke carried her tray through the crowded space, a sandwich, an apple, a bottle of water, moving with the kind of fluid efficiency that came from years of navigating tight spaces. The doctor's table was near the service line, unavoidable. Caldwell stood abruptly as she passed, his elbow rising in what might have been an accident to anyone not paying attention. The tray left her hands before she could stabilize it. Soup and salad exploded across the tile floor in a spectacular, catastrophic mess that drew 30 pairs of eyes. The sound of breaking ceramic echoed like a gunshot in the sudden quiet. "Oh, sweetheart, you should be more careful," Caldwell said, his voice dripping false concern. His smile was a shark smile. "These things happen." Brooke stood completely still for 2 seconds. Her hands hung at her sides. Her face was blank as stone, the kind of blank that takes years of discipline to achieve, the blank of someone who'd learned long ago that showing reaction was showing weakness. Then she kneeled, picked up the tray, walked to retrieve paper towels, and cleaned every drop in methodical silence while residents whispered and Caldwell watched with satisfaction blooming across his face like ink in water. She disposed of the broken ceramic pieces, rinsed the towels, and returned to her work without saying a word. But when her 15-minute break came, Brooke sat alone in the supply closet on an overturned bucket, surrounded by boxes of gauze and bottles of sterile saline. The door was closed. No one could see her. Her hands shook for the first time that shift, actual tremors, the kind that came from holding everything in too tight for too long. She stared at the floor, at the concrete and dust and the faint scuff marks from years of supply carts rolling past. Her fists clenched and unclenched. She allowed herself this, 60 seconds of clenched fists, 60 seconds of the raw fact of her anger burning like fuel in her chest. Then she pressed her palms against her thighs, took 3 measured breaths, and her hands went steady. When she walked back onto the unit, she was unmoved again. Untouchable. A ghost in Navy scrubs. The 3rd incident happened during rounds. Caldwell was reviewing a patient's lab work when he accidentally knocked the chart from the counter. It fell at Brooke's feet, papers scattering across the hallway floor like confetti. "Pick that up, sweetheart. That's what nurses do, right? Clean up messes." He said it with a smile, in front of 2 residents and a visiting physician who suddenly became very interested in the floor tiles. Brooke bent smoothly, gathering each page in order, a skill that came from organizing field reports in sandstorms, from collecting shell casings in rubble. Her movements were precise and unhurried, each page aligned perfectly as she reassembled them. She stood, handed him the chart with the binding intact, and said only Dr. Caldwell in acknowledgement before returning to her rounds. Her voice was quiet, professional, empty of anything he could weaponize. What she didn't do was cry, or tremble, or ask him to stop. What she didn't do was report him to HR or engage in his game. She simply continued her work as if he'd said nothing at all. That refusal to break, that was what terrified him. Caldwell's strategic moves began the next day, surgical in their precision. He called Margaret Chen, the chief hospital administrator and his wife's college roommate, during lunch at the country club. Concerning patterns in Nurse Sullivan's judgment calls, he mentioned casually, letting concern color his voice. Margaret promised to review personnel files. He contacted Linda Vasquez, head of the hospital board, during their weekly tennis match, dropping seeds about nurses overstepping scope of practice. Linda suggested bringing in an outside consultant to review nursing protocols, which meant paperwork, which meant scrutiny, which meant visibility. He made a personal call to Brooke's previous employer in Dallas, identifying himself as conducting a routine reference check, asking pointed questions about her departure. Were there any undocumented incidents? He let the question hang like a threat. The HR director sounded confused. Their record showed exemplary performance, but Caldwell's tone was the kind that planted doubt even when facts contradicted it. And then, on a Tuesday morning, a new patient arrived in the ICU. A 58-year-old man in dress Navy uniform, unconscious from a cardiac event during what the intake sheet only described as a classified briefing at Lackland Air Force Base. The paperwork listed him as J. Patterson, Admiral, USN. No further details. The kind of vagueness that meant someone important. Caldwell saw the assignment board and smiled. A high-profile military patient. Visibility. Opportunity. Brooke took the assignment without apparent reaction, checking vitals, adjusting before drip, moving through the routine with professional precision. Her face was carefully neutral as she reviewed his chart. 58 years old. Dark eyes. The kind of jawline that looked distinctive even weathered by age and exhaustion. Naval Academy class of 1985. 3 tours in Middle East operations. The bio photo showed a man in uniform, confident and composed. She stared at his unconscious face for a fraction longer than necessary. Ahmed Patterson. 20 years ago, in Tikrit, he'd been 6 years old and bleeding from shrapnel wounds. She'd pulled him from rubble under heavy fire while a mortar round tore through the air where he'd been standing 2 seconds before. She'd carried him 2 kilometers through streets that smelled like cordite and dust and fear until the evac bird landed. She whispered his old name, Ahmed. So quietly that no one could possibly hear her, her voice barely moving air. Then she returned to her charting, her hand steady, her face blank, her mind already processing what it meant that he was here, in her hospital, under her care, and that no one could know she recognized him. The classified operation. The erased records. The years of silence mandated by naval intelligence. The boy she'd saved had grown into an admiral, and he was lying in a bed in St. Michael's in San Antonio, and she was the only person alive who knew why she'd never been decorated for it. Brooke checked his oxygen saturation, 96%, stable. She adjusted his monitor leads with precision and whispered the unit motto, the one from her old life, the word she hadn't spoken aloud in 2 decades, the only easy day was yesterday. Then she turned away and continued her shift as if her entire past hadn't just arrived at her hospital unconscious. The night shift at St. Michael's moved like a machine with several parts grinding loose. Brooke stood at the central station reviewing Admiral Patterson's chart when her pager buzzed, Margaret Chen, the chief hospital administrator. She recognized the name immediately. Margaret and Dr. Caldwell's wife had roomed together at Rice University 23 years ago, a detail Brooke had overheard in the break room during her second week. The network was already moving. She found a quiet corner near the supply closet and dialed. Margaret's voice came through professional but strained, like someone reading from a script she'd been handed moments before. Ms. Sullivan? I need to discuss some concerns that have come to my administrative attention regarding your credentials and your recent clinical decisions here at St. Michael's. Dr. Caldwell felt it was important that we verify your background more thoroughly. Do you have time to come to my office tomorrow morning before your shift ends? Brooke's jaw tightened. Just slightly. Just enough for her own body to feel it, not enough for anyone watching to see. My credentials were verified during hiring, Ms. Chen. They're on file. Of course they are. Still, we'd like to have a conversation. Shall we say 7 in the morning? The call ended. Brooke set the pager on the counter and breathed through her nose, the way she'd learned in a barracks outside Fallujah, tactical breathing, in for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4. The anxiety wasn't hers. It belonged to someone else. Someone who'd never seen what she'd seen, never done what she'd done. She was just watching that person's body react from very far away. But that wasn't the worst part. By 10:41 p.m., 3 separate phone calls had been made to 3 separate board members. Brooke didn't witness them, but she felt them landing, the way the air in a room changes when a predator enters. Dr. Caldwell moved through the hospital with the smooth confidence of a man whose calls were already being returned. He stopped by the central station where Brooke was reviewing labs, stood close enough that she could smell the cologne he always wore, something expensive that never quite covered the scent of his anxiety underneath. "You know, in my 30 years at this hospital, I've never seen a nurse quite so aggressive with her clinical opinions," he said to the residents gathered around the desk, his voice warm as a spotlight. "I'm not saying she's wrong about everything. That would be unfair. But there's a certain humility that comes with experience. Understanding the limits of your scope of practice. Not everyone has that." One of the residents laughed nervously. The others shifted their weight. Brooke continued reading the potassium levels on the screen in front of her, her hand steady on the keyboard, her breathing unchanged. Caldwell waited for a response that never came, and when none arrived, he smiled, the smile of someone who'd already won, and walked back toward the physician's lounge. He was 3 steps away when his phone rang. She watched him answer, watched his expression shift into something that looked like surprise, though she suspected it wasn't. Not really. The call lasted 90 seconds. Then another call came through. Then another. By midnight, the hospital's entire administrative structure had been put on notice that there were questions about a certain nurse's qualifications and judgment. The beauty of it, and it was beautiful, in the way a surgical strike is beautiful, was that nothing had been said that was technically false. Just concerns raised. Just questions asked. Just meetings being scheduled with outside investigators. The machinery of institutional bureaucracy, once set in motion, doesn't need much force to keep moving. Brooke checked on Admiral Patterson at 12:15 a.m. His blood pressure was 118/76. His heart rate ran at a steady 68 beats per minute. His central venous pressure read normal. Everything was stable. Everything was fine. Except it wasn't. The numbers were stable, yes, but the pattern was wrong. She'd seen this pattern before, in a field hospital outside Mosul in 2003, when a Marine came in with shrapnel in his chest and his vitals looked acceptable for exactly 42 minutes before his heart stopped responding to everything they threw at it. The pressure was building. The fluid was accumulating. The numbers didn't show it yet because cardiac tamponade was like a slow-motion squeeze, you couldn't see the pressure rising until it was already critical. She made a note in the chart. BP trending down slightly. CVP climbing by small increments. Recommend EKG and echocardiography for baseline. Then she found Dr. Caldwell in the physician's lounge, where he sat reading something on his phone with the posture of a man who'd already won the match he was fighting. "Admiral Patterson's vitals are showing some subtle changes," she said. "I'd like to recommend cardiac imaging to rule out." "His vitals are within acceptable parameters," Caldwell said without looking up. "Stop bothering me with routine fluctuations." "His post-operative. Some variation is expected." "Yes, sir." "But the pattern." "That's an order, Ms. Sullivan. Routine nursing concerns. Nothing more." She stood there for 3 seconds, her hands at her sides, her breathing steady, her face blank as a hospital wall. Then she turned and walked back to the ICU. At 12:51 a.m., his blood pressure dipped to 115/72. At 1:10 a.m., it dropped to 112/68. The CVP climbed another millimeter. The pieces were moving slowly, like dominoes set far apart, and she was the only one watching them fall toward each other. She made another note. She found Caldwell again, this time in his office. The trend is continuing, she said. I think we should get a cardiology consult before. I am the attending physician on this case, he said, and now his voice had an edge to it, the edge of a man whose patience with being questioned was fraying. Your job is to monitor vitals and report changes. You've reported them. I'm making the clinical decision not to intervene. If you have a problem with my judgment, you can file a complaint with the nursing supervisor. But you will not go around me to cardiology. Is that clear? Yes, sir. Good. Now get back to work. At 1:33 a.m., everything changed. Admiral Patterson's heart rate spiked from 72 to 96 in the space of 4 heartbeats. Then 104. Then 118. The blood pressure plummeted, 114/68, 108/64, 102/58. The central venous pressure climbed sharply, like a stock ticker in a crash. And then the cardiac monitor alarm screamed, that high-pitched wail that sounds like metal under stress, like something breaking apart from the inside. Brooke moved before conscious thought. She was at the central station, she saw the numbers, she heard the alarm, and her body responded the way a body responds after 2 decades of muscle memory, instantly, without debate, without permission. Admiral Patterson's door was 3 steps away. Nurse Jenkins was in room for 12 with a patient who'd just been extubated, trying to get the man comfortable in his first minutes of unassisted breathing. The ICU was staffed at minimum capacity because it was 1:44 a.m. on a Tuesday and San Antonio hospitals never planned for emergencies at convenient times. Caldwell was somewhere in the hospital. The crash cart was 8 steps from Patterson's room. The phone to call for help was on the wall. Brooke stood at the central station and watched the numbers drop. 98/52. 94/48. The alarm screamed like something dying. She had been ordered off this case. She had been warned about overstepping. She knew exactly what disobeying would cost her, her badge, her reputation, the careful invisibility she'd maintained for 2 decades. She'd built an entire life on the principle of not drawing attention, of being just another nurse, just another set of hands doing the work that needed doing. One intervention, one act of medical judgment made without authorization, and that would be over. The monitors screamed. Jenkins was still in 412, singing softly to her patient, something about getting through the night. The hallway was empty. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like they always did, indifferent to cardiac crises and career choices and the weight of decisions made in the dark. Brooke reached for the crash cart. The monitors screamed at 2 in the morning. Brooke heard it from the medication room, that particular frequency spike that meant cardiac crisis, the sound every ICU nurse learned to recognize in her sleep. She was moving before her conscious mind caught up, abandoning the 4 bags on the counter, her feet crossing the tile in 4 strides that covered the distance to Admiral Patterson's room like muscle memory itself was navigating. The alarm wailed. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm underneath it all. Jenkins stood frozen by the bedside, her hands hovering uselessly over the monitor. "Step back," Brooke said. It wasn't a request. It was a command, and something in her voice made Jenkins obey without question. The monitor told the story in real time, blood pressure 70/40 and dropping, heart rate climbing past 130, the central venous pressure spiked like a mountain range. His neck veins distended against his skin, his breathing shallow despite the ventilator's best efforts. Muffled heart sounds. The clinical presentation was textbook, brutal in its clarity, cardiac tamponade. Fluid was crushing his heart like a fist closing around a rose, and at this pressure gradient, he had minutes. Maybe less. The procedure required a physician's authorization. There was no time. Brooke reached for the ultrasound machine with the fluid grace of someone who had performed this under far worse conditions, mud, chaos, the smell of diesel exhaust and copper blood mixing with antiseptic that never quite worked. Her hands didn't shake as she applied the transducer gel, didn't hesitate as she located the pericardial sac on the screen. Dark fluid surrounded the Admiral's heart like a threat. The ultrasound probe felt familiar against her palm, the same weight it had always carried. She found the optimal window, measured the fluid depth, and knew exactly where to place the needle. 18 gauge. Yellow hub. She selected it with the precision of a surgeon choosing a scalpel. "Stay with me, Ahmed," she whispered, too quiet for anyone else to hear. The name slipped out without permission, his real name, the one from before he was Admiral Patterson. The one from Tikrit. She positioned the needle below the xiphoid process, angling toward his left shoulder at the exact angle anatomy demanded, advancing slowly under ultrasound guidance as if she had performed this procedure 1,000 times instead of 3. Because she had. Those 3 times had been in conditions that would make this moment look like a controlled clinical demonstration. The needle advanced. 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 Then the subtle give, the needle's bevel piercing the pericardium itself. She was in. Brooke attached the syringe and withdrew with steady pressure. Bloody fluid filled the chamber. 40 milliliters. Then 50. The monitor's tempo changed almost immediately, no longer the frantic screaming of collapse but the measured rhythm of a heart being released from its crushing prison. 60 milliliters. 70. Patterson's blood pressure climbed as if she was physically lifting it with her hands. 80 over 50. 90 over 60. His cardiac output returning like a light switch being flipped. 100 over 70. The monitor stopped screaming. Jenkins ran in, freezing at the doorway with her mouth open like she'd witnessed something that shouldn't exist outside classified briefings. 2 residents appeared behind her, their eyes wide enough to fall out of their skulls. The ventilator wheezed its rhythm. The 4-pole dripped steadily. The room smelled like antiseptic and sweat and the particular chemical tang of adrenaline in the air. Brooke set the syringe down on the sterile field with the care of someone placing an artifact in a museum, her hands perfectly steady, her breathing controlled like she'd spent decades learning to breathe through things that would suffocate normal people. That's when Dr. Caldwell arrived. She heard him before she saw him, the sound of his shoes hitting the tile with furious force, his breathing ragged like a bull preparing to charge. His face was purple. Actually purple, the color of veins near rupture, the color of rage that had nowhere left to go except outward. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, and his voice, when it came, shook with the kind of fury that suggested his entire worldview had just collapsed. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Brooke glanced at him with the same expression someone might use while checking the weather. Professional. Unimpressed. Completely calm in a way that made the temperature in the room seem to drop 10 degrees. Pericardiocentesis for cardiac tamponade. The patient is stable. You just performed a procedure that requires, Caldwell's voice rose higher, cracking slightly at the edges. You don't have the authority. You don't have the training. You don't have. The patient would be dead if I waited for authorization. Caldwell's face turned a shade darker. His hands clenched tighter. You just ended your career. By 3:15 in the morning, Brooke sat in the nursing director's office on the 3rd floor while Dr. Caldwell laid out the charges like evidence in a prosecution. Practicing medicine without a license. Defying direct orders from a physician. Performing an unauthorized procedure that violated Hospital Protocol Section 7.2 subsection D, which clearly stated that no nursing staff could initiate invasive procedures without explicit physician approval. His voice had taken on a lawyerly precision, the kind of careful documentation that suggested he'd already been planning this conversation before Patterson's heart even started failing. Margaret Chen sat behind her desk in her bathrobe. Someone had called her at home at 2:47 in the morning and listened with the expression of someone watching her entire institution crumble. He would have died, Brooke said. Quiet. Not defensive. Just stating facts. That's not the point, Margaret said, and the weariness in her voice suggested she'd already made her decision before walking into the room. By 4 o'clock in the morning, the decision had been formalized. Termination for gross violation of hospital protocol. Effective immediately. The paperwork was already being prepared by someone in HR who was probably just waking up to find urgent emails in their inbox. By 5:30 in the morning, Brooke's badge had been deactivated. They literally shut it off in the system, so when she swiped it on her way out, it beeped red, and security walked her to the employee locker room to collect her belongings. They didn't stand over her shoulder. They didn't need to. The message was clear enough without words. She walked out through the emergency entrance as dawn broke over San Antonio. The sky was pale gray, turning pink at the edges, the kind of sunrise that came after no sleep. Her car was in the parking lot exactly where she'd left it 17 hours ago. The drive to the diner took 12 minutes. She chose a booth by the window, the kind that faced out toward an empty street, and ordered coffee she didn't drink. The cup sat in front of her, steam rising off the surface, cooling in the particular way of diner coffee that had been sitting under a heat lamp for 3 hours. Her reflection stared back at her from the dark window glass, eyes that had seen too much, face that had learned how to show nothing, hands that had held lives together in worse places than this. She had kept her head down at St. Michael's for 3 months. She had swallowed every insult, absorbed every humiliation, maintained the mask of just another night shift nurse in navy blue scrubs. She had done everything right. She had saved the Admiral's life. And they had fired her anyway. 20 years of silence to protect an institution's rules. 20 years of being invisible. 20 years of survival purchased at the cost of her own identity. And it had bought her nothing. Nothing at all. The coffee went cold in her hands. The rotor wash came first, a distant thump that built in intensity until it rattled the diner windows and set off car alarms in the parking lot. Brooke looked up from her reflection in the glass. The sound grew louder, approaching from the northeast, that particular heavy percussion of military helicopter blades working air into submission. She recognized it before she saw it, UH-60M Black Hawk. Navy colors. The aircraft descended toward St. Michael's parking lot like a judgment, rotors still spinning as it touched down with practiced precision on the concrete pad near the emergency entrance. The clock on the wall read 6:47 in the morning. 4 sailors in dress uniforms stepped out from the aircraft in synchronized movement. Blue service dress with ribbons on their chests, the uniform of sailors who didn't spend their time behind desks. They strode toward the emergency entrance with the kind of purpose that made people stop what they were doing and stare. The security guard, a Marine veteran named Rodriguez, took one look at the insignia on their shoulders and went rigid. His hand moved to the radio at his belt, then stopped. He stepped into the main hallway of St. Michael's and his voice carried through 3 separate corridors with the authority of someone who had spent 30 years learning how to make himself heard. Master Chief Petty Officer on deck. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. A resident froze with a clipboard halfway to her chest. A doctor in scrubs looked up from his tablet. Dr. Caldwell emerged from his office, his expression confused, his authority crumbling like paper in water. The lead sailor, a commander with the bearing of someone who made decisions that changed the course of operations, looked at Rodriguez and said one word. Reaper. The name hung in the hallway air like a bell that had just been rung. Behind the commander, a 2-star general in marine dress blues entered through the emergency doors, his shoes clicking on tile with the precision of a man who had spent 40 years learning that sound carried weight. His face was carved from stone. His eyes were the color of a stormy Atlantic. He walked past Dr. Caldwell without a glance, without a pause, without any acknowledgement of the man's existence. Nurses and doctors pressed themselves against walls. A resident pulled out a phone. The general stopped in front of Dr. Caldwell and opened a leather portfolio with the formality of a judge reading a sentence. Dr. Caldwell, the general said. His voice carried like tank engines idling in a garage. We have some questions about your actions this morning. But he was already moving past him, walking toward Brooke's section of the hospital. The commander and the 3 sailors followed. Caldwell turned to follow them, his mouth opening and closing like a fish, his institutional authority suddenly worth nothing against the weight of the United States Marine Corps walking through his hallways. By the time Brooke reached the parking lot, her badge had already been deactivated. Security, 2 men in polo shirts who wouldn't meet her eyes, walked 3 paces behind her, their presence a public statement to anyone watching from the 3rd-floor windows. Dr. Caldwell watched from his office, silhouette framed against the glass, one hand raised in a small wave as if sending off a friend. Not a threat anymore. Just a nurse who'd overstepped, who'd broken the chain of command, who'd learned that confidence without credentials was just arrogance wearing scrubs. The badge clattered against the asphalt as she threw it into the recycling bin outside the ER entrance. 3 years of night shifts. 347 patients. And she was walking away as if she'd never been there at all. The diner was empty at 3 in the morning. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead like they were the only other living thing in the building. Brooke sat in a booth with a cup of coffee that had gone cold 40 minutes ago, staring at her reflection in the darkened window. The woman looking back at her was a stranger, hair pulled back, eyes that had seen things no civilian eyes should see, hands that trembled now, but not from fear. From restraint. From 18 years of holding something down so deep that it had calcified into bone. She could disappear. She'd done it before. New name, new state, new life. Vanish into the civilian world like she'd done 20 years ago when naval intelligence ordered her to become nobody, to forget every classified operation, every citation, every moment of glory that had to be erased because the mission itself was erased. She'd been good at disappearing. Master Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan had died in Tikrit, and the woman wearing her skin had learned to smile through every humiliation because smiling meant surviving. But then came the Admiral. The sound reached the hospital at 05 for 7 hours, a distant thud that grew into a roar as the Black Hawk descended toward the parking lot, rotors slicing the dawn air into pieces, the aircraft touching down with the weight of institutional authority made visible. For sailors in dress blue stood and moved, their boots hitting the asphalt in unison, the kind of synchronized motion that only came from a lifetime of military discipline. They moved through the emergency entrance like they owned it, and everyone parted because you didn't obstruct the Navy. The hospital security guard, a former Marine named Holloway, took one look at the insignia on the lead officer's shoulder and went pale. His mouth opened, closed, and then words came out in a voice that carried through 3 hallways and stopped every conversation cold. Master Chief Petty Officer on deck. The phrase hung in the fluorescent-lit silence like a prayer or a threat, depending on who was hearing it. Caldwell emerged from the stairwell on the 2nd floor, drawn by the commotion, and froze when he saw the general, a 2-star with intelligence patch on his uniform, stride past him without acknowledgement. The general didn't slow down. Didn't glance sideways. Caldwell simply ceased to exist in that moment, and everyone watching understood the hierarchy being quietly re-established. Brooke was standing in the hallway outside the medication closet when the general found her, and she didn't move. Not because she was frozen, she'd never been frozen in her life, but because moving would have telegraphed something she didn't want anyone to see yet. Her hand stayed at her sides, steady as surgical steel. Master Chief Sullivan, the general said, and the title landed like a defibrillator shock. You are authorized to hear your record read in the presence of witnesses. He didn't ask permission. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Staff nurses gathered. Residents stepped out of patient rooms. Even the janitorial crew stopped their morning routine because something was happening, something that felt larger than the hospital itself. The general opened a folder and began to read, and with each sentence, Brooke felt the weight of 20 years beginning to shift. 3 Navy crosses. He paused. Around them, people inhaled sharply. Nobody at St. Michael's had ever worn 3 Navy crosses. 5 Bronze Stars with combat designation. Another pause. A nurse in pediatrics put her hand over her mouth. 17 years in Naval Special Warfare Operations Command. He looked up from the folder. Classified service record, level 5 clearance, active duty status continuously maintained. Then he closed the folder and stepped aside. Admiral Patterson, fully awake now, standing on his own with just a nurse's arm as balance, raised his hand and pointed directly at Brooke. His voice was thin from 3 weeks of ICU sedation, but it carried the weight of command. When I was 6 years old, she pulled me from rubble in Tikrit during a mortar attack. I was bleeding. I was screaming. And she took shrapnel to her back, shielding me from secondary fire because she wouldn't leave until the evac arrived. He paused, and the silence was so thick you could operate in it. This woman gave up her career, her commendations, her identity to disappear into civilian life because her country asked her to. And she did it without a word. Without a complaint. Without ever expecting recognition. He looked directly at Caldwell, who was backing toward the stairwell. And you thought she was just a nurse. The doors burst open. Two men in dark suits, FBI badges visible on their belts, moved with the fluid precision of apex predators. They walked straight to Caldwell, who actually tried to run, but Holloway blocked the stairwell exit with the bearing of someone who'd guarded much worse than a panicked physician. Dr. Robert Caldwell, the first agent said, "You're under arrest for attempted forgery of military service records and unauthorized access to classified Department of Defense databases." Caldwell's knees buckled. His mouth moved soundlessly. You submitted a memorandum to the Pentagon questioning her credentials," the second agent said, already reading him his rights, "and you made 7 separate calls to Naval Personnel Command attempting to verify her identity. Those calls triggered automated alerts. The Department of Defense has been watching you since call number 3. The handcuffs went on with a sound like fate clicking into place. Margaret Chen, the hospital administrator, backed away from Caldwell as if proximity to him might contaminate her. Linda Vasquez, the nurse manager who'd signed off on the termination order at Caldwell's insistence, already had her phone out, already calling her attorney. The residents watched as the man who'd controlled this hallway for 20 years was walked past the woman he'd tried to destroy, and Brooke's face remained blank as stone. She didn't smile. Didn't acknowledge him. Didn't give him the satisfaction of her attention. That was the most devastating thing she could do, treat his humiliation as utterly irrelevant. Caldwell tried to meet her eyes one last time as he was escorted toward the exit, desperate for some reaction, some flicker of emotion that would prove she'd felt his cruelty. But Brooke was looking at Admiral Patterson instead, at the man he'd become, at the living proof that everything she'd sacrificed had mattered. The Admiral stepped forward and extended his hand. His grip was weak from weeks in intensive care, but his voice carried absolute certainty. "Master Chief, the Secretary of the Navy personally requested your presence at Bethesda Naval Hospital at 0900 tomorrow morning. It's time to come home." 6 months later, someone spotted Dr. Robert Caldwell at a folding table outside a strip mall on the south side of San Antonio, selling supplemental insurance policies to passers-by. His medical license had been permanently revoked. His criminal conviction for falsifying federal documents ensured he would never practice medicine again. No one stopped to talk to him. They never did. At Bethesda Naval Hospital, a different kind of ceremony was unfolding. Brooke stood in dress whites in a ceremonial room packed with sailors and officers and medical personnel who understood what they were witnessing. Behind the podium, a glass case held her worn combat boots, the same boots that had carried her through 20 years of silence, through secret and classified operations and deployments that would never be acknowledged. Next to them hung her Navy crosses and a photograph, a 6-year-old boy covered in dust and blood, held in the arms of a younger Brooke in desert fatigues. Admiral Patterson stepped forward, his uniform gleaming, fully recovered, back to active duty. He held a small box. For 17 years, he said to the assembled crowd, this commission was denied due to classification restrictions. For 20 years, Master Chief Sullivan served in complete silence, her record erased, her sacrifices buried, because her country asked her to disappear into civilian life and never look back. He opened the box, and gold oak leaves caught the light. Today, we correct that injustice. He pinned the insignia to her collar as the room erupted in applause that sounded like rainfall on metal. Master Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan was no longer a title in secret files. She was Master Chief Brooke Sullivan, Lieutenant Commander, Navy Medical Corps, honored and recognized and finally visible. At the reception afterward, a young sailor, barely 22, fresh from boot camp, approached her carefully. "How did you stay strong through it all?" the sailor asked. 20 years of silence. The humiliation. Losing everything. Brooke glanced at the glass case holding her boots, then turned back to the young sailor. Her voice dropped low, steady as it had been for 2 decades. True class is what you do when the lights go out. When no one's watching. When no one will ever know. When there's absolutely no reward coming, that's when you find out who you really are. Admiral Patterson raised a glass from across the room, and Brooke raised hers in return. Two survivors of Tikrit. 20 years and a lifetime apart. Finally home. Subscribe and like for more stories of unsung heroes, the ones who served in silence and came home to recognition. And drop a comment, tell us, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong?